She didn't ask his name. She didn't post pictures. She simply left a sandwich and tea on the same old bench every single morning for 6 years. To everyone else, he was just a homeless man with tired eyes and a tattered coat. But on her wedding day, when he stepped into the church, 12 U.S. Marines followed, in full uniform, saluting the bride. What had begun as a quiet act of kindness was about to become a moment that shook an entire room and changed the lives of hundreds who were once invisible. This is not just a love story. This is the story of how one woman fed a forgotten hero and built a legacy the world almost overlooked. The air inside St. Augustine's chapel was thick with perfume polish and expectation, each pew filled with carefully dressed guests murmuring softly under the glow of mid-morning sun pouring through stained glass. Soft violin music floated through the space, wrapping the congregation in a gentle prelude to a celebration months in the making. On the altar, white roses cascaded from tall crystal vases like frozen waterfalls, and a gilded aisle runner stretched forward like a path to heaven itself. The wedding planner's headset crackled with urgency as she double-checked timelines and flower placements, muttering about corsages and sequence cues. Everything had to be perfect. But perfection shattered the moment a man stepped into the church, his clothes pressed but clearly old shoes polished, though scuffed, and hair combed with care but silvered with time. Conversations halted. A whisper slithered through the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. "Don't tell me she invited him." The speaker, a sharply dressed woman in navy satin, arched a brow and leaned closer to her husband, whose jaw clenched in discomfort. "That homeless man from the corner," she added, her voice tight with condescension. All eyes followed the unassuming figure as he hesitated in the doorway, holding his hat in both hands like an apology. His presence drew tension tighter than any cello string, eyes narrowing, lips pursing. The wedding had just begun, and already a storm brewed in the sanctuary of love. But up in the bridal room, unaware of the murmurs gathering like thunder below, Madeline Carter stood still before an antique mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the lace veil that framed her delicate features. 30-years-old hair swept into a soft chignon. She looked radiant in an off-the-shoulder gown that shimmered like moonlight. Her best friend tightened a bracelet on her wrist and whispered something about breathing slowly, but Madeline's thoughts were scattered. Her eyes kept drifting to the church entrance, visible from the window, her heart fluttering with a strange tension that had nothing to do with vows or rings. Then she saw him, the old man in the doorway, and time froze. The room spun not with fear or confusion, but with something deeper, a recognition buried in routine, worn into her bones, over years of quiet mornings and silent exchanges. She didn't ask questions. She didn't care about cameras, timelines, or the voice of the wedding planner buzzing frantically in the hallway. She gathered the hem of her gown in trembling hands and ran her heels, tapping out a wild rhythm on the polished floors as gasps followed her descent like a chorus of disbelief. The planner shouted something about ruining the entrance shot. Someone called out her name. None of it mattered. She reached the door, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, her eyes wet, his tired but warm. Then she threw her arms around him. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, trying not to stare. Some failed. Others whispered. One elderly aunt even pulled out her phone to document what she clearly believed was an act of foolish charity. But Madeline clung to the old man like he was family, like she'd waited years to speak the words now caught in her throat. "I remember your eyes," she said softly. "That first morning in 2017, you were sitting by the phone booth and you looked up at me like I wasn't invisible." His voice, when it came, was low and cracked but steady. "And you, Miss Carter, fed me like I mattered, every single day, rain or shine." She looked down, embarrassed and heart-swollen. "I didn't think you remembered me. I never forgot," he said. "You gave me reason to wake up when I'd given up on everything." From somewhere behind them, a champagne glass shattered on the tile, its crisp echo silencing the whispers. Then the church doors flew open again, but this time not with chaos. Precision, discipline, authority. 12 Marines in full dress uniform entered in perfect formation, their boots hitting the floor in sync, their posture upright with the kind of reverence reserved for funerals or presidential detail. The air shifted. The room fell still. Children stopped fidgeting. Cell phones dropped to laps. The man who had once seemed a disruption now stood still as the captain at the front of the formation stepped forward and brought his hand to a rigid salute. On behalf of Alpha Company 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, he declared in a voice that filled every corner of the cathedral, "We are here to honor the woman who silently sustained a hero for 6 years." And for the first time that morning, every guest finally turned not with judgment, but with awe toward the woman who had slipped out of the bridal room in a cloud of ivory lace. To embrace a man they never thought worth noticing. It hadn't started with pity or even intention, just a simple instinct on a cold morning. The year was 2017. Madeline Carter, then newly hired at Mad Cut's studio in downtown San Diego, was unlocking the salon at 5:30 a.m. The city still hushed under a fog of marine layer and silence. She always arrived early, long before her manager or co-workers, craving the solitude of sweeping floors and preparing coffee stations before the rush of walk-ins and color appointments. That morning, she noticed him. An old man in a tattered army jacket seated beside the rusted phone booth just across the alley, staring at the ground, with a stillness so complete it made her chest ache. He wasn't panhandling. He didn't speak. He simply sat, for a reason she couldn't explain. Madeline went back inside, pulled the extra breakfast sandwich she'd packed from her bag, egg cheese sourdough, and walked across the lot. Without a word, she set it on the bench beside him, then returned inside without looking back. The next morning, she did it again. And again. Soon, it became routine. She would stop by the deli 2 blocks down, buy one sandwich for herself, one for him, and a small iced tea, she learned, after some weeks was the only drink he consistently touched. She left it on the bench quietly, always before sunrise, always wrapped in a napkin with a simple note. "Wishing you peace today." She never signed it. He never responded, but he always took the food. Her coworkers never asked. At first they assumed she just liked long walks before work, but as years passed and faces changed, whispers started. One stylist called it her homeless hobby. Another joked that she was training a pet. Even her manager, though, smiling politely, reminded her during a quarterly review that the alley wasn't the safest place and that maybe she should donate through the proper channels. But Madeline never missed a morning. Not during rainstorms, not during the early COVID shutdowns. Not even on days when her hands were trembling from heartbreak or exhaustion or stress. Because over time, that man, though he never gave his name, became her compass. Her proof that even in a world obsessed with selfies and curated compassion, quiet kindness still meant something, still mattered. And then came the winter storm in late December 3 years ago. A bitter cold snap left much of the city shuttered. That morning, she spotted him shivering uncontrollably, soaked from the downpour. Without thinking, she unwrapped the scarf from her neck, an old gray wool thing her grandmother had knit, and placed it gently beside his meal. The next morning, tucked into the napkin, was a note. Pencil. Shaky handwriting. 4 words. "Thank you for seeing me." She kept that note in her wallet, folded behind her ID. Whenever the world felt too loud, too cruel, too unkind, she would take it out, hold it, and breathe. Ryan had seen the note once after she cried during a documentary about veterans with PTSD. He never pried, but one evening he kissed her forehead and said, "You never ask for anything back. I think that's what makes your kindness so loud." She never told anyone she was planning to invite the man to their wedding. In truth, she didn't. She hadn't seen him in over a week. Part of her feared he had disappeared for good. Part of her wondered if maybe that's how it was supposed to be, anonymous, distant, sacred in silence. But then the letter arrived, hand-delivered, no name, no return address, just a white envelope with her name in careful cursive. To the bride. Inside was a small card blank, save for one line. "Tomorrow I will come, not for cake, but to honor a debt." It wasn't until she saw him standing in the church doorway, hair-combed, coat-button posture upright, that the truth hit her like a tidal wave. It was him, Sergeant Elijah Brooks. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know his rank, his past, his grief. All she knew soul deep was that he mattered, and that for 6 years, even when the world told her she was wasting her time, she had been feeding a man who remembered, a man who had not forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Now, as they stood at the entrance of the church, arm in arm, the guests still reeling from the arrival of the Marines, Madeline whispered, Would you walk me down the aisle?" His hands shook, his eyes welled, and all he could manage was a single nod. The Marines saluted in unison. The organ began to play again this time, not for tradition, not for formality, but for something far more sacred, the reunion of a forgotten hero and the quiet girl who refused to let his memory disappear. The hush that fell over the church was unlike anything Madeline had ever heard, not the reverent quiet of prayer, nor the stunned silence of grief, but something deeper, heavier, as if every breath in the room had been collectively held at once. The 12 Marines had stopped just inside the doors, their boots aligned in crisp symmetry uniforms, pristine metals polished to glint like fire beneath the cathedral's soft lighting. Their formation was exact deliberate, and at its head stood a man with a square jaw, steady gaze, and the poise of someone who had faced death and lived to salute it. His nameplate read, Duncan. He stepped forward with the weight of duty in his shoulders, paused exactly 3 feet from where Madeline and Elijah stood, and brought his hand up to a sharp, flawless salute. The motion, clean and controlled, seemed to pierce the very tension in the room. Then he spoke, his voice a deep, unwavering baritone that rolled through the sanctuary like distant thunder. On behalf of Alpha Company 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, we are here to honor the woman who silently sustained a hero for 6 years. Murmurs surged, guests craning their necks to look at Elijah as if seeing him for the first time. The very same man they had judged seconds ago now stood at the center of a military tribute. But Captain Duncan was not done. He turned slightly, gesturing to the man beside Madeline with unmistakable reverence. This, he said clearly, is Sergeant Elijah Brooks. In the winter of 2004, during an ambush near Fallujah, he carried 9 wounded Marines out of enemy fire. I was one of them. The gasps were audible now, cascading through the pews like waves breaking on a shore. Despite taking shrapnel to his own leg and shoulder, he returned for more again and again. His actions earned him the Silver Star. He never claimed it, never sought recognition. After the war, Sergeant Brooks lost his wife and only daughter in a car accident. He disappeared from the system, never used his benefits, never told anyone his story. Duncan's voice cracked slightly, the edge of military control, giving way to something older and more human. He vanished, until she found him. His eyes shifted to Madeline now, visibly trembling as she held tightly to Elijah's arm. Except she didn't find him like the VA would have. She didn't search records or trace medals. She found him in the cold, on a bench, with a sandwich. Tears were forming now, not just in Madeline's eyes, but in the eyes of men and women who, moments ago, had whispered disapproval. Some were visibly shaking their heads, not in disbelief, but in shame. For 6 years, Duncan continued. She brought him food. She brought him dignity. She never asked who he was, never asked what he had done. She simply saw a man who was hungry and chose to feed him not with charity, but with humanity. One of the older guests, an uncle in a stiff gray suit, stood slowly removing his hat with trembling hands. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His posture said, "What words could not, I misjudged you." Another Marine stepped forward, holding a velvet shadow box in his gloved hands. Inside lay a worn photograph, faded with time, and a polished metal resting against navy blue silk. The photo showed a younger Elijah Brooks, dirty, bleeding, determined, carrying a Marine across a war-torn street while gunfire and smoke blurred the background. That Marine, now clearly older but recognizable, was Captain Duncan. "He carried me 4 blocks under fire," Duncan said, his voice heavy with reverence. "He went back for others after me. I owe my life to this man, and today I owe my peace to the woman who kept him alive when the rest of us forgot he even existed." The weight of the moment pulled the room into absolute stillness. Even the youngest guest, too young to understand war, sensed the gravity. Elijah bowed his head slightly, emotion flooding his weathered face. "I didn't come here for thanks," he said softly. "I didn't want anyone to know. After losing my family, I couldn't stand to be seen as a hero when I couldn't even save the people who mattered most." He looked at Madeline with eyes that held every year of silence between them. "But you never asked for my story. You never demanded my name. You just fed me, looked at me, left notes like someone might actually want me to live through another day." Madeline's makeup had long surrendered to tears streaking her cheeks with quiet devastation. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "I just didn't want you to be invisible." Captain Duncan stepped back, raising his voice one final time. "In the Corps, we have a saying, never leave a Marine behind. Ms. Carter, Though you never wore the uniform, you lived that creed better than most men I've ever served with. With that, the Marines moved into formation, creating a silent, solemn honor guard from the church entrance to the altar. Each stood tall, hands at their sides, eyes fixed forward in respect. It was no longer a wedding. It was a moment carved into time, a ceremony not just of love, but of redemption. The guests stood, some crying openly. One of Madeline's bridesmaids stepped forward, choking back tears. "I work with Madeline," she said to the crowd. "Every day for 6 years she came in early. I used to think she just liked quiet mornings, but she came early to make sure he had fresh food. She paid for it herself, never told anyone, not even us." Another stylist, face pale, admitted, "We teased her, laughed about it, said she was wasting time." Her voice cracked. "I've never been so wrong." Elijah turned to Madeline, cupping her hands in his. "I came today to give you the only thing I have left, my presence, my truth, and my gratitude. I heard you mention your wedding once years ago while talking to a client. I didn't mean to listen, but I did. I remembered the date, and I contacted some old friends." Madeline smiled through sobs. "You gave me the most beautiful wedding gift I could ever imagine." Then Ryan stepped forward, silent, until now his eyes bright with emotion. "Sir," he said, extending his hand to Elijah, "it would be my honor if you would walk Madeline down the aisle." There was a pause, a collective inhale, and then the applause began, quiet at first, then growing into something raw and cathartic. For Elijah, for Madeline, for the dignity that had been silenced for too long. As they began to walk slowly down the aisle, escorted not just by a man once thought broken, but by 12 Marines standing in solemn tribute, every guest stood. Every doubt vanished, and the only thing louder than the silence was the echo of redemption. As Madeline and Elijah moved slowly down the aisle, arms linked her wedding gown, trailing behind like a whisper of grace, every guest rose to their feet, not because the planner motioned them to, but because something sacred was unfolding before them. The church, once divided by whispers and judgment, now pulsed with reverence. Some wiped tears from their cheeks, others clasped hands or simply stood, frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a wedding, a miracle, or both. The music resumed, but it was different now. The melody of canon in D had always been beautiful, but in that moment it became transcendent no longer. The background of flowers and cameras, but a hymn to something deeper. Endurance unseen, service, the quiet dignity of doing good without being asked. Ryan stood waiting at the altar, his back straight, fists gently clenched at his sides, not out of nervousness, but out of overwhelming emotion he could barely contain. He had known Madeline was remarkable. He had fallen in love with her kindness, her integrity, the way she refused to look away from pain, but even he had not realized the full scope of her silent strength. As Elijah approached, the two men locked eyes. No words were exchanged, but there was a gravity in that gaze that transcended language. A man who had once carried comrades through enemy fire now carried the bride of a new generation, not on his back, but beside him, upright, seen alive. When they reached the front, Elijah paused and gently turned toward Madeline. His hands, weathered and calloused, cradled hers as if they were porcelain. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost," he whispered, "the belief that I was still part of this world." Her voice shook as she replied, "You reminded me that small things matter, that being kind even when no one's watching can mean everything." Elijah turned toward Ryan, offering Madeline's hand like it was a sacred relic. "Take care of her," he said softly but with the weight of command. "Because she's already taken care of more souls than most of us ever will." Ryan nodded solemnly, gripping Elijah's hand with both of his. "With everything I have." Then Elijah stepped back into formation, with the Marines standing at attention as the ceremony officially began. The officiant, an old family friend of Ryan's, cleared his throat, visibly moved. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we gather here today, not just to witness a marriage, but to bear witness to a truth that has been made undeniable, that love in its purest form is not only romantic, but courageous. And today, we celebrate both." The vows were short, spoken through tears and laughter. Ryan promised to protect Madeline's heart, to never belittle her softness, to be the man who saw people the way she did. Madeline vowed to honor Ryan's fire, to be his shelter on hard days, to build with him not just a home, but a haven. When they exchanged rings, there was no fumbling, only hands that found each other as naturally as breath. The kiss was gentle, long, the kind that silences rooms and leaves an ache in the chest, not from sorrow, but from being reminded that some things are still profoundly good in this world. The applause that followed wasn't enthusiastic, it was thunderous. It wasn't about the dress or the decor or the timeline. It was a release, a collective unburdening, a moment when everyone in that church realized they were walking out different than how they walked in. At the reception, there were no questions about Elijah, no awkward glances. Guests approached him with humility, with apologies, with gratitude. Some just stood near him, unsure what to say, but needing to share space with someone who had come back from the edge of nothing. Captain Duncan made a quiet toast. To those who show up, he said, lifting his glass. Not for praise, not for thanks, but because they can't bear to see a soul go unnoticed. Madeline Carter, you reminded us of that. Glasses clinked, eyes blurred. Elijah stayed near the back of the room, quietly observing sipping ginger ale and nodding to anyone who approached. At one point, Ryan leaned over and asked, "Would you be okay if we used part of our wedding gift money to start something small?" Madeline tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "Not a charity, just a place, a bench, a table, somewhere people like Elijah can sit and be fed. Not because they earned it, not because they proved anything, just because they exist." Her eyes welled again. "I'd love that." The idea was born then in a corner of a reception hall scented with roses and laughter. Not flashy, not grand, just real. It's just necessary. They would call it the gentle bench, a breakfast cart, a permanent seat, a sign with no logos, no sponsors, just carved words, feeding one life may save another. That night, long after the guests had gone home and the lights dimmed, Elijah approached Madeline and Ryan quietly. "I won't be around much," he said. "There are places I need to go, things I need to work through." Madeline nodded. "I understand." He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, folded paper carefully kept. "But I'll write, every month. Just so you know, I'm still waking up." She unfolded the paper and saw the original napkin, the very first one she ever wrote on. "Wishing you peace today." Her handwriting faded but unmistakable. He smiled. It worked. And with that, he disappeared into the night, not as a mystery, but as a man finally reclaiming his name. The idea took root quietly, like most beautiful things do not in boardrooms or marketing pitches, but in late-night whispers between two people who understood that compassion didn't need headlines to matter. Within a week of their wedding, Madeline and Ryan began sketching out plans for the gentle bench, not with grand ambition, but with purpose. They found a small shaded corner near the back entrance of Madcut's studio, where a crumbling concrete slab bordered the alley. Most people passed it without looking. It had once held a bench for waiting customers, long since rusted and removed. To everyone else, it was a forgotten patch of pavement. To Madeline, it was sacred ground, the spot where Elijah had once sat, in silence receiving kindness, one sandwich at a time. They commissioned a local carpenter to build a simple bench oak, sturdy, polished by hand. Above it, they installed a wooden sign, hand-carved by Ryan himself, over 2 weekends. "The gentle bench, feeding one soul may save another." There were no donation jars, no promotional flyers. Madeline refused offers from well-meaning friends who suggested she apply for nonprofit status or call a news crew. "This isn't about being known," she said softly. "It's about making sure someone else feels seen." Every morning before sunrise, Madeline would place a tray on a small folding table beside the bench, 3 breakfast sandwiches, 2 hard-boiled eggs thermoses of coffee and tea, and a folded napkin with a simple message written in black ink. Sometimes it read, "You matter." Other days, "May your day be lighter." The words varied, but the heart behind them never did. At first, few came. The bench remained empty for days at a time, but Madeline never stopped preparing the tray. Hope, she told Ryan, needs somewhere to sit. And eventually people came not in crowds but in ones and twos. A man with a torn duffel bag who refused eye contact but always returned the next day. A woman with sun-scorched cheeks who asked if she could take 2 cups of coffee, one for her and one for her sister who talks to the sky. A teen in a hooded sweatshirt who never said a word but left behind carefully folded napkins in exchange for breakfast. Each visit was a story waiting to be honored, not examined. Madeline never pried, never asked for names. She simply nodded, offered the tray, and let them be. Word began to spread, not through social media, but through the invisible networks that connect people on the edge of survival. The bench became a landmark among those who had little left but memory and bone-deep fatigue. The lady with the kind eyes leaves food there, someone said near a shelter. She doesn't judge, another added. She just shows up. And then one Monday morning, something changed. When Madeline arrived with her tray, she found someone already sitting at the bench, not someone she recognized. It was Captain Duncan now, in civilian clothes, a ball cap low over his brow, a duffel bag at his feet. "Thought I'd take the first shift," he said, standing. "Shift?" she asked, confused. He handed her a folded note, his eyes crinkling with a grin. Inside was a list, 12 names. All Marines, all volunteers. Each one assigned a day of the week. "You started something," he said simply. "We're not going to let it die." Madeline's hands trembled as she held the paper. "You don't have to." "We know," he interrupted gently. "But we want to. He was our brother. You saved him when we didn't even know he needed saving. Let us honor that." True to their word, the Marines came one by one, never in uniform, never seeking attention. They brought food, swept the area, left fresh napkins with notes that echoed Madeline's original tone. "Your story matters, one step at a time. We're glad you're still here." The community noticed. Nearby businesses offered to supply extra sandwiches. A local cafe dropped off pastries twice a week. One anonymous donor left cases of bottled water with a note that read, "For the bench that saved my brother's life." But even as the bench became a quiet symbol of something powerful, Madeline refused to let it become spectacle. When a local reporter called to request an interview, she declined. "Talk to the people who sit here," she said. "This isn't my story, it's theirs." Ryan Ever, her silent partner, helped install a small plaque at the base of the bench, dedicated to Sergeant Elijah Brooks and the unseen heroes among us. They never heard from Elijah directly, but once a month, like clockwork, a postcard arrived, always from a different city: Detroit, Phoenix, Atlanta, New Orleans, always signed the same way. "Every breakfast is a salute, thank you." E.B. Madeline kept them in a shoebox beside her bed, arranged by postmark date tied with ribbon. On difficult mornings, when the sky refused to lighten and the tray felt heavier than usual, she'd reread a few lines. It reminded her that kindness didn't need to echo loudly to leave a mark. Then came the first anniversary. Madeline and Ryan arrived early, planning to clean the bench and leave a bouquet of wildflowers Elijah used to glance at in the alley. But as they turned the corner, they stopped short. Waiting at the bench were the 12 Marines this time, in street clothes, each holding a single white flower. Captain Duncan stepped forward. "We wanted to take this day," he said softly, "to remember what it means to show up." He handed Madeline a folded napkin. Inside was another note from Elijah, mailed weeks in advance. "You gave me back my name. I'll spend the rest of my days honoring that." That day they served 27 people, some new, some familiar, none forgotten. At dusk, Ryan lit a single candle near the bench. No speeches were given, no cameras flashed. Just the flicker of a flame, a worn wooden seat, and a community that had learned what it meant to see the invisible and choose day after day to keep them company. It started with a clipboard, not a shout, not a protest, just a man in a neatly pressed city-issued polo shirt, walking down the alley with purpose and pause. He stopped in front of the gentle bench, scribbled something, took 3 photographs with his tablet, and left without a word. Madeline didn't even notice him. At first she was busy arranging the tray for the morning, pouring hot tea into a thermos, laying out fresh sandwiches and napkins, with that day's message, "You belong here." It wasn't until a week later, when she opened her mailbox and found a sealed envelope stamped City of San Diego, Department of Public Spaces, that her stomach sank. The letter, though worded politely, was painfully clear. "Your bench and food distribution setup, while admirable in spirit, is currently in violation of City Code 7.16/108B, which prohibits unauthorized food service operations on public property. Failure to remove the bench and cease all related activities within 10 business days will result in formal citation and potential legal action." Ryan read the letter 3 times before setting it down. "We knew this could happen," he said gently. "But that doesn't make it right." Madeline sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the window as if waiting for Elijah's postcard to arrive early and tell her what to do. She didn't cry, not yet. Her heart had already cracked so wide from the lives she'd seen pass through that bench, faces that came without names, shoulders that had slumped from years of wait eyes that had learned not to expect gentleness. Taking it away felt like erasing them all over again. That night she typed out an appeal, her words careful but firm. She included photographs not just of the bench but of the napkins, the tray the flowers placed there every week by people who had nothing else to offer. She closed with a line that came not from anger but ache. If there's no space in this city for quiet compassion, what exactly are we preserving? She mailed it with shaking fingers, but no optimism. Bureaucracy had no ears. 2 days later, the Marines returned uninvited, unnotified, as if summoned by some invisible signal. Captain Duncan stood beside the bench with his arms crossed, reading the posted citation notice taped to the backrest. He didn't speak right away. When he finally looked at Madeline, there was a fire in his eyes she hadn't seen since the day he saluted Elijah. "You built something here," he said. "We're not letting it be torn down with a memo." The next morning before sunrise, the gentle bench looked different. There were no trays, no tea, no napkins, but there were people. Dozens, former visitors, veterans, volunteers, teenagers in hoodies. A retired nurse who had once sat in silence for 3 mornings before finally whispering, "Thank you." They weren't loud. They didn't chant. They just sat, elbows brushing backs, straight eyes forward. One by one, they brought their own folding chairs and lined them up beside the bench. Ryan counted 17 by the time the sun rose. By the following morning, there were 42. Someone made signs. "We are the bench. Kindness is not a violation. She fed us when no one else did." A woman from a local newspaper showed up, then a student journalist, then a morning radio host. Word spread not through Madeline's doing. She had no desire for cameras, but because those who had been lifted by her silence refused to let it be erased without a voice. The mayor's office issued a bland statement. "While we appreciate grassroots outreach, public safety and health codes must be maintained." But when pressed, they could not point to a single complaint. No injuries, no illness. Just paperwork. On day 8, the envelope arrived. The appeal had been denied. The bench had to go. Ryan braced himself. He expected Madeline to collapse or rage or retreat. Instead, she quietly packed a duffel bag with the napkins and postcards and drove to City Hall. Alone. She didn't request a meeting. She sat in the public visitor area across from the reception desk and simply opened her bag. One by one, she laid the napkins across the marble floor like offerings. "You saw me. Thank you for not crossing the street." The world was quiet, and then there was breakfast. One staffer stopped, then another. A custodian knelt beside her. "This one," he said softly, picking up a napkin with tear stains on it, "was from my brother." She nodded, unable to speak. A photograph of her display surfaced on social media within hours. A city councilwoman came down in person, quietly removed her shoes, and sat beside Madeline on the marble tile. "We've been getting it wrong," she said simply. "We forgot what laws are supposed to protect." The next morning, Madeline returned to the gentle bench to find a laminated notice posted where the citation used to be. It read, "This bench is recognized by the City of San Diego as a community compassion site, protected under revised Municipal Code 7.16.108C, authorized for sunrise breakfast service and community support programming." She didn't cheer. She didn't shout. She simply placed a new tray, poured hot tea, and laid down a napkin that read, "Still here. Still yours." That morning, Elijah's postcard arrived. It bore a single line written in looping ink from a VA hospital in Chicago. "Some wars are fought without bullets. You won this one for all of us." They thought it would stay small. They wanted it to stay small. A bench, a tray, a message, that was all. No foundation, no merchandise, no public figure with a following. Just breakfast and dignity offered in silence. But kindness, when done consistently and without pretense, has a way of spreading like wildfire through hearts tired of watching the world look away. Within 2 months of the city's reversal, other benches began to appear. First in Ocean Beach, outside a surf shop, owned by a veteran who had once sat beside Elijah in silence. Then in Barrio Logan, where a retired librarian began leaving fresh bread and bottled water with hand-drawn bookmarks that read, "Your story matters." A pastor from Chula Vista reached out requesting guidance on how to create a compassion zone outside his church, not for proselytizing, but for presence. Madeline created a simple guide, not instructions, but reflections. She called it How to Feed, without asking why. Rule 1, never ask for a name. Rule 2, look them in the eye. Rule 3, leave something even when no one comes, because someone will. One morning in August, she arrived early to the gentle bench to find something odd waiting beside the tray. A folded American flag the size of a handkerchief, bound with a ribbon and a small brass key. Attached was a card. When we take care of each other, we all get to come home. She didn't recognize the handwriting. She didn't need to. Elijah was still out there leaving echoes. The Marines rotated weekly now. Some brought food, some brought books. One even taught a yoga class in the alley on Saturday mornings. Matt placed beside the bench, telling participants, "You don't have to fix the world today. Just sit with it." Madeline watched it unfold with quiet wonder. She never tried to lead. She refused invitations to speak. She kept cutting hair during the day, sweeping floors at Mad Cuts with the same deliberate care she had always shown. But people noticed something in her now, a gravity as though the kindness she'd extended had rooted itself so deeply that she walked differently, carried something unseen. Then one evening, as golden dusk soaked the alley in soft orange hues, she saw him. Sitting at the far end of the bench, back straight, hands folded in his lap, was Elijah. Not a postcard, not a symbol, the man. He looked thinner, slower, his cane resting beside him like a forgotten thought. But his eyes, they were the same, sharp, gentle, watching. She dropped the tray, sandwiches scattered, thermos tipped. She didn't care. She ran to him. "You came back?" she gasped, falling into his arms. He hugged her with the careful strength of someone who had fought too long to allow anything to shatter again. "I promised I would," he whispered. "I couldn't stay away forever." She pulled back, eyes scanning his face like she needed to memorize it all over again. "You look better." "That's because of you," he said. "And them?" He nodded toward the line forming across the street, volunteers, neighbors, strangers. "You kept me alive. They reminded me why." He reached into his coat, pulled out a weathered envelope. Inside was the silver star, the real one, the one he had never claimed. "I want it to stay here," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Not because I need recognition, but because this bench, it's where the battle ended." She stared at the medal, then at him. "You're the bravest man I've ever met." He shook his head. "No. The bravest people are the ones who show up without being asked. Who keep showing up? You did that. Without uniform, without orders. Just a sandwich and a napkin." That night they sat together in silence for nearly an hour. She didn't ask where he'd been. He didn't offer. They didn't need to. The stars came out slowly one by one above the alley that once held only shadows. And when Elijah stood to leave, he left behind not just his footprints, but the sense that something sacred had returned. Not a war hero, not a homeless man, just Elijah. Seen, known, home. The first time Madeline saw her own face on a screen, it was by accident. She had stopped at a corner coffee shop before opening Mad Cuts for the day, waiting in line behind a man with wireless earbuds and a military jacket, when she glanced up at the wall-mounted television above the espresso machine. The screen displayed a morning news segment, cheerful anchors seated beneath bright studio lights, their voices upbeat as they introduced a story labeled "Local Acts of Quiet Heroism." At first she smiled at the phrasing, but then the footage changed, and there she was, kneeling beside the gentle bench, laying out napkins, her profile caught in perfect morning light as she poured tea with both hands, unaware she was being recorded. Her smile faded. The clip ended with a sweeping shot of the alley flowers tucked along the wooden frame, a subtitle scrolling beneath her name, Madeline Carter, the woman who fed a forgotten hero. A customer turned to her and said, "Hey, that's you, isn't it?" She nodded faintly, but inside, her heart was twisting. She hadn't wanted this. Not the recognition, not the headlines, not the tidy narrative the world loved to write about kindness as if it were a rare act of sainthood instead of a daily discipline that required no applause. By the end of that week, 3 different journalists had emailed her. One asked for her origin story. Another wanted to create a docu-series around modern compassion. The last offered a small publishing deal if she'd consider writing a memoir. She didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she spent longer mornings at the bench, sitting quietly after the tray had been placed, letting the silence remind her why she had started in the first place. But the world didn't stop noticing. A major corporation offered a sponsorship. A tech startup wanted to digitally scale the gentle bench to underserved cities. A city official she barely knew suggested turning it into an official municipal wellness station. Every offer came with polite contracts, marketing teams, vision boards. And all Madeline could think about were the hands that had once trembled as they lifted a sandwich from the tray without speaking. She remembered the napkins stained with raindrops and coffee, the single flower someone had left. On the third Tuesday in April, the postcard from Elijah that read, "Some mornings, just seeing that tray kept me breathing." None of those moments could be scaled. None of them fit into a corporate brochure. One evening, she sat on the floor of her small living room, napkins and postcards spread out like constellations, and asked Ryan, "What if I'm being selfish?" He looked up from the tray he was sanding for a new bench location in North Park. "How do you mean? What if keeping it quiet, keeping it small, means I'm keeping it from people who need it more?" He set the wood down and walked over, crouching in front of her. "Maddie, you didn't build this to become a brand. You built it to give people back their names. And if you protect that, if you protect what made it sacred, it will keep growing. But if you let someone else tell the story, they'll turn it into something you won't recognize." She stared at the napkin in her hand, one that simply said, "Thank you for not asking me who I used to be." That night, she wrote her own letter, not to a company or a city board, but to the people who had sat at the bench, to those who had written her, to the Marines who showed up without being summoned. She called it the Quiet Manifesto. It was just 4 paragraphs long, no signatures, no hashtags. She posted it to a simple blog created that night with no photos, just plain text. It read, "In part, we do not need 1,000 benches. We need one bench 1,000 times placed with care, kept with respect, and never named after the person who built it. If you create your own, bless it with silence. Feed without condition. Offer without story. Let those who come decide what it means to them. And when they leave, let them go without needing to be thanked." Within 2 days, she received nearly 200 messages, not from followers, but from guardians. People who had quietly built their own versions. A woman in Vermont sent photos of a painted rocking chair she kept on her porch where she left cocoa and mittens in winter. A retired bus driver in Chicago who called his bench the layover. A teenager in Oregon who left bagged lunches beside a bus stop and wrote notes that said, "You were worth waking up for." None of them used her name. None of them asked for hers. And that was the point. Madeline wept softly the night, not from sorrow, but relief. She had feared that letting the world know would ruin the thing she built. But instead, she had learned that truth travels fastest when carried by those who understand its weight. The next morning, Elijah returned again. He didn't sit this time. He stood beside the bench, hands folded behind his back, and said simply, "I saw the news." She groaned. "I didn't mean for any of that." "I know," he smiled. "That's why it didn't ruin it." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a coin, small and bronze, etched with a Marine insignia on one side and a single word on the other. "Honor. We used to pass these to men who showed courage in the field. I want you to have it, because you never left anyone behind." She held it like it might break. "But I never served." "No," he said. "You just did what we're all supposed to do. You remembered people." That night, she placed the coin in a small wooden box next to the silver star beneath the tray she now used daily. On the lid, she carved a single phrase, "Legacy is built in silence." And when she closed the box, she felt not the weight of being seen, but the strength of being understood. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of morning when the air felt heavier than usual, and the sky hadn't yet decided between sunlight and storm. Madeline arrived, tray in hand, the scent of fresh eggs and black tea rising into the stillness of the alleyway, and stopped cold. The bench was gone, not vandalized, not burned, simply missing. The bolts that once held it to the concrete had been cleanly unscrewed, leaving behind only rust-stained circles and an echo that rang louder than any siren. Her hands trembled, tea sloshing against the lid of the thermos. She dropped the tray. Hard-boiled eggs rolled across the pavement. The sound of glass shattering startled a stray cat from the shadows. For the first time in years, Madeline felt the sharp primal sting of something deeper than anger, betrayal. But not betrayal by a person, by the promise of permanence, by the illusion that goodness once built could never be undone. She stood there alone for what felt like hours, the tray still upturned beside her feet. By the time Ryan arrived, having been called away from the gym, where he taught a morning self-defense class, she was still standing there, arms limp at her sides, jaw tight, with the grief of 1,000 silences breaking all at once. They took it. She said the words barely a whisper. They just took it. Ryan didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The city hadn't sent notice. There were no legal orders. Whoever had removed it had done so in the night in secret, the way people try to erase things they don't understand. Within hours, the news spread, not through media this time, but through mouths that had once been too ashamed to speak. People who had once sat on that bench, people who had left only napkins and crumbs behind, showed up. Some stood, some wept. One man, a former sailor with scars up his forearms and a stutter he had fought for decades, simply knelt on the concrete and traced the missing bolt holes with his fingers like a grave marker. Captain Duncan arrived by midday not in uniform, but in jeans and a hoodie bearing the faded letters USMC. He said nothing, just looked at Madeline, then turned to the empty space where the bench had once stood and began pacing the perimeter with the measured calm of a man preparing for battle. "We rebuild," he said finally. But not with wood this time. That afternoon, 12 men and women, former Marines, firefighters, teachers, artists, addicts, turned sponsors, began carrying in slabs of stone. One had borrowed a pickup truck. Another brought cement mix. A woman Madeline had never met arrived with gloves and whispered, "I used to eat here when I was 5 months pregnant and too scared to ask for help." By sundown, a new bench stood, not handmade from oak, but chiseled from granite, engraved with words etched in steel across the backrest. "You fed me when the world forgot I was hungry." Above it, a new plaque gleamed beneath the dim alley light. "This space is protected not by law but by memory. Tampering with it dishonors every name never asked." Madeline watched them work, tears streaking down her dust-covered cheeks, heart pounding with a mixture of rage and awe. She didn't know who had taken the original bench, but she knew they could never steal what it had become. The next morning, when she returned with a tray, a line had already formed, but not just of those who came to eat. Children were there holding flowers, elderly couples with walkers, businessmen in suits who paused just long enough to nod. And then came the unexpected dozens of people carrying their own chairs, folding ones, lawn chairs, milk crates. They lined the alley with them one by one, side by side, until the pathway looked like a theater built for something sacred, and in silence they sat. Not talking, not posting, just present. Someone played violin. A boy handed out sticky notes for people to write their own messages. Ryan walked between them, offering water. Madeline set down the tray, shaking overwhelmed, then sat beside the new bench on the curb, hands in her lap, her body finally releasing the grief she'd carried for the last 24 hours. Elijah arrived at noon. He wore a suit jacket too big for his frame and a baseball cap from Fallujah 2004. He walked slowly, deliberately, and when he reached the bench, he didn't sit. He knelt. "I know you didn't ask for this," he said, looking up at her, "but maybe this was always going to happen. Maybe people needed something to fight for that didn't require anger, just a place." She nodded through her tears. "I just wanted people to be seen. And now they are," he said, "even the ones who haven't come yet." That evening, Ryan installed a final addition, a small motion-triggered light above the bench that softly illuminated only when someone sat down, as if to say, "We see you now, always." And in the weeks that followed, no one dared touch the bench again, because it no longer belonged to one woman or one alley. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible, and to those who finally found the courage to sit beside them and stay. The letter came in a silver-trimmed envelope with a gold seal and official font, the kind of paper that felt heavier than it should, as if importance had a weight all its own. Madeline found it wedged between a grocery store flyer and a dental appointment reminder in her mailbox, and for a moment, she almost didn't open it. She had grown suspicious of formal envelopes ever since her story had gone public, each one promising opportunity, recognition, legacy, but always demanding something in return. But this one was different. Inside was a folded sheet engraved with her name and signed by a senator. It congratulated her on being selected as the recipient of the National Humanitarian Service Award, an honor given once a year to an individual whose quiet actions had created measurable change in their community. She was invited to speak at the Capitol, to accept the award on national television, to stand beside diplomats and decorated leaders, a dinner gala, to follow televised coverage to proceed. There was even mention of a foundation scholarship in her name, the Madeline Carter Initiative for Community Compassion. Her hands shook as she read it, not from excitement, but from unease. That night, Ryan read the letter in silence, then set it on the kitchen table without a word. He didn't want to influence her. He knew better than anyone how fragile the soul of the gentle bench really was. But Madeline could feel the weight of his thoughts, the worry behind his silence. If I go, she whispered, it becomes something else. Ryan nodded slowly, and if you don't go, they might turn it into something else anyway. She spent the next 3 days doing what she always did, showing up before sunrise, laying out sandwiches and tea, folding napkins, sweeping the alley. But something had shifted. More people came now, not to sit, but to watch, to take photos, to hashtag. The silence had begun to crack under the buzz of admiration, as if being seen too much could erode what had once made the bench invisible but sacred. One woman approached her with a podcast mic. "What made you decide to start this?" she asked brightly. Madeline looked at her, then at the bench, then at the woman's logo-embroidered jacket. "I didn't decide," she said quietly. "I just noticed someone was hungry." The next day, Elijah came. He hadn't been in weeks, his health taking unpredictable turns, his gait slower, his shoulders thinner beneath the weight of a lifetime. He sat beside her, eyes on the tray, and said, "They told me about the award." She sighed. "I don't know what to do." "You do," he replied. "You just don't know if the world will forgive you for choosing it." She turned to him, voice soft. "If I go, they'll expect more benches, more interviews, a brand. But if I stay, maybe the people who matter will keep coming." He nodded, eyes never leaving the spot where his own name had once been whispered through napkins. "Then stay. Let the world find its heroes somewhere else. We know where ours are." That night she wrote a letter, handwritten, folded, carefully sealed, with the same care she once gave every sandwich she wrapped. She mailed it to the committee, declining the award in full. No substitutions, no appearances, no public statements. Just one line written in her neat, steady handwriting: "Kindness that needs a spotlight was never kindness at all." She didn't expect a reply. She didn't want one. What she got instead was silence, and for Madeline Carter, that was everything. 2 days later, she arrived at the gentle bench as usual, tray in hand, tea still steaming, and found something unexpected. 12 chairs carefully arranged in a semicircle around the bench. On each chair sat a person, not a reporter, not a tourist, but someone who had once eaten there in silence. They didn't speak, they simply nodded. On the bench itself lay a single napkin placed there before she arrived. 4 words in someone else's handwriting. "You made us visible." That morning, the world kept spinning emails, unanswered, invitations, ignored headlines, forgotten. But in that narrow alley under a sky just beginning to blush with dawn, Madeline Carter chose something the world had almost forgotten: how to honor the sacred radical act of staying small on purpose. And in that smallness, she had become infinite. It was a Friday morning, the kind that carried just a whisper of fall in the breeze, the kind where steam rises slowly from paper cups and shoes tap a little softer on pavement, as if even the world knew it needed to move more gently. Madeline had just finished arranging the tray: 3 ham and egg sandwiches, 2 cups of chamomile tea, 1 extra boiled egg, because she'd had a feeling and was tying the last note to a napkin when she heard it. A sound sharp and unnatural, like a bag dropping, but heavier, followed by a gasp that cut the air in half. She turned, heart already racing, and saw Elijah crumpled at the base of the bench, one arm stretched toward the backrest, as if trying to steady himself, the other twisted beneath him. His cane had rolled out of reach. His cap lay sideways on the ground. She dropped the tray and ran. "Elijah," she shouted, falling to her knees beside him, her hands fluttering uselessly over his shoulders as she tried to assess what was happening. His face was pale, eyes half-closed, mouth slightly open but silent. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, and Madeline felt her breath hitch as the world narrowed to the space between her fingers and his failing pulse. Ryan appeared within seconds. He'd been parking the car around the corner and immediately dialed 911, voice calm but urgent, while kneeling beside Madeline, one hand on her back, the other checking Elijah's breathing. "He's faint but stable," Ryan said, eyes flicking between Madeline's panicked face and Elijah's still chest. "We've got time, but not much." The ambulance arrived in under 5 minutes, sirens strangely out of place in that sacred alley. Paramedics moved with the efficiency of those who've seen everything, lifting Elijah with practiced care, attaching monitors, whispering vitals into radios. As they wheeled him toward the van, Elijah stirred for a second, his eyes finding Madeline's through the blur. "Don't!" he whispered, his voice barely there. She leaned closer. "Don't let it stop." Then the doors closed, the van disappeared, and the bench was left holding its breath. Madeline stood, frozen hands, shaking eyes locked on the spot where he'd fallen. Ryan wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself collapse into his chest, into her fear, into the uncertainty of what came next. By noon, word had spread. The Marines came first, Captain Duncan, solemn and silent, followed by two others all dressed in plain clothes, but carrying the weight of uniform in their posture. Then came the others, former visitors, neighbors, volunteers. People she didn't recognize, but who carried the same look in their eyes, a mix of concern and reverence. No one said what happened. They knew. Instead, they sat, one by one, filling the chairs, filling the silence. A teenage girl brought sunflowers and laid them beneath the bench. A man in a construction vest carved Elijah's initials into a piece of driftwood and tied it to the lamppost. Someone played Sam Cooke on a small speaker. No one touched the tray. It stayed where Madeline had left it, spilled, but untouched, as if even food knew it wasn't time yet. That evening, Ryan and Madeline visited the hospital. Elijah was unconscious in the ICU, vitals stabilized but fragile. The nurse said he had spoken briefly before slipping under again, asking only one question. Did she save the bench? Madeline sat by his side for hours, her fingers curled around his. The napkin he once returned folded in her lap like a prayer. She didn't cry. Not then. She simply whispered stories to him. The time a woman in a blue hoodie left her own drawing in exchange for breakfast. The time a lost dog found the bench before its owner did the note left by a 6-year-old that said, "You smiled at me. I didn't think adults noticed." She spoke until the sun rose, until nurses switched shifts, until her voice grew hoarse with hope. The next morning, something miraculous happened. When she returned to the bench expecting the usual stillness, she found the tray already set, napkins folded, tea poured, sandwiches warm. At first she was confused. Then she noticed a small laminated card taped to the backrest. It read, "Until our brother sits again, we serve in his place. Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." Each day after that, someone different arrived before her. A Marine, a volunteer, a former bench guest now back on their feet. They set the tray. They watched over the space. They honored the man who had never asked for honor. It became something more than ritual. It became a vow. Days later, Elijah awoke. Madeline was there. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He looked at her and smiled, weak but real. Still standing, he whispered. She nodded, eyes shining. Always. And in that moment, they both knew that the gentle bench had become something indestructible, not because of the wood or stone or steel, but because every person who had sat there had left behind something invisible, a piece of themselves, a memory, a promise. And now it would carry them all, even the ones who might not return. It happened in the soft gray stillness of an October morning, the kind where the sky blushes before the sun dares to rise, where leaves fall with the weight of memory, and not just gravity, where the air feels like it's listening. Elijah Brooks passed away in his sleep at 6:12 a.m., 3 weeks after returning home from the hospital. There was no struggle, no final gasp, just a quiet exhale that left the world a little more hollow, but somehow fuller at the same time. Madeline received the call from Captain Duncan, who had been visiting Elijah that night. He didn't say much, just that Elijah had smiled one last time, whispered something about tea and benches and being seen, and then closed his eyes like a man laying down a burden he'd carried longer than anyone knew. For the first time in years, Madeline did not go to the bench that morning. She stayed in bed, the quilt drawn up to her chin, the postcards Elijah had sent over the years, spread out across the sheets like tiny gravestones and love letters all at once. Ryan brought her tea but didn't speak. He knew grief has its own rhythm, and asking it to move faster is like begging the tide to rise out of order. But by noon, she rose. She dressed simply. No makeup, no earrings. Just a dark coat and the soft gray scarf Elijah had once returned to her, with a note that said, "Thank you for seeing me." She walked alone to the alley, half afraid it would be empty, half afraid it wouldn't. What she found stopped her breath. The bench was surrounded, not by cameras, not by press, but by people, dozens of them, faces she recognized, others she didn't. all of them holding something: postcards, napkins, flowers, pieces of paper, letters. Captain Duncan stood beside the bench, his head bowed. A young boy sat quietly on the ground, drawing a picture of a sandwich. An old woman wept into a knitted shawl. And on the bench itself, someone had placed a single folded American flag. Beside it, a note that simply read, "He saved lives on the battlefield." And again, here. No one led a speech, no one organized an event. But people came in waves throughout the day. Veterans, students, nurses, teachers, formerly homeless guests who hadn't been seen in months. They came with stories, not demands, with silence, not spectacle. A teenager left a letter tucked into the bench's metal frame. "You once gave me food when I hadn't eaten in 4 days. I never said thank you. I am now." A man in a suit knelt and prayed. A woman scattered sunflower petals in a quiet circle around the bench, one for every week she had come while pregnant with a child she was now raising alone. And then at dusk, as the sky bled amber and lilac, Madeline stepped forward. She didn't speak from a podium. She didn't read from paper. She just placed her hand on the backrest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you, Elijah, for choosing to stay a little longer." The wind stirred, catching the corner of the flag, lifting it slightly as if in salute. That night, instead of closing the bench, the community kept vigil. Lanterns were lit. Tea was served. Stories were shared. For the first time, no one left before midnight. And in that darkness, something eternal was planted. Weeks later, Ryan and Madeline established a new sign, not larger, just deeper. It read, "This is not a memorial. It is a continuation. Sit, rest, be remembered." They also opened a second bench not far away near a library where people gathered but rarely lingered. Then a third in a city across the country, sponsored not by money, but by people who had once eaten in silence and wanted others to do so with dignity. But none were called the Gentle Bench. That name remained sacred, untouched forever, tied to an alley in San Diego, where a woman once placed a sandwich and unknowingly rewrote a man's ending. Every year, on the anniversary of Elijah's passing, no ceremonies are held, no speeches. Just one napkin placed on the bench with 6 words, "We remember you. We remember us." And in that alleyway, the world continues hurried, noisy, forgetful. But beneath it all, a quiet resistance remains. A tray, a seat, a note, a name, not shouted, just known. And that more than any statue or spotlight is what lasts. Because sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is see someone the world has chosen not to. And sometimes the bravest thing you can offer is breakfast. Not every hero wears a uniform, and not every legacy is carved in stone. Sometimes it's a warm meal placed without a name, a napkin that simply says, "You matter." Elijah Brooks may have fought on the battlefield, but it was her quiet kindness that brought him home. So if you've ever passed someone without looking, if you've ever wondered whether one small act could really make a difference, let this story be your answer. Because someone out there doesn't need you to fix their world. They just need you to see them in it. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments. Like this video. Share it with someone who believes in silent strength. And don't forget to subscribe to FlowStory, where the quietest acts make the loudest echoes.